I am in my studio in San Antonio, and I have my dear friend Valerie White sitting in her home, and we're going to have a conversation today about art and creativity and the things that help us tick. And I'd like to start by introducing Valerie and talking about her a little bit, because I don't think she'd brag on herself as much as I'd like to brag on her. She's an award-winning fiber artist and has been creating quilts for more than 20 years and was originally an art educator in the District of Columbia Public Schools. And this is just a continuation of her passion through her teaching and through lecturing, and just by being really who she is. She's been widely exhibited across the United States and internationally, and her work appears in lots of publications, including 500 Art Quilts and Quilting Arts Magazine and Creative Spaces Magazine, and in several of Dr. Carolyn Mazlumi's books from the Women of Color Quilters Network. And she's a juried member of the Studio Art Quilt Associates and turns up in lots of their publications. And she and I have known each other a pretty long time, and I'm really interested to talk to her about what makes her tick and what fuels her creativity. So thank you for being here and taking time for this today, Valerie.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. It's exciting.
It is. It's such a pleasure.
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit in your statement about growing up in New Jersey and not having a lot of role models and positive influences. And so I think most people are really interested in other people's stories and histories. So will you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, sure. I was very fortunate in high school. There was a really big art program. We had art history, we had crafts, we had fine arts, painting, ceramics, just a host of things. And I took to it like a duck in water, and I really, really, really enjoyed it. And it encouraged me to consider art as a vocation. At that time, I was sort of floundering. I didn't know what I wanted to do. Well, long story short, I ended up at Howard University as an art major. But I had never in my entire life been able to be in the company of other African American artists. And these folks were at the cutting edge of redefining the Black aesthetic and the obligation of the African American artist. And it just filled my 17-year-old head full of questions and pride, and it made me want to work harder because I had Lois Mailou Jones as a watercolor teacher. And she used to give away her watercolors, and I feel like now, what an airhead I was. I should have stood in line an hour for those things, but, at that time, it was not only the art that was the big influence, but the social. Because I came from a very small town, and I had not been in Washington, D.C. It was so cosmopolitan. I decided, oh no, if I die, I want to be buried right here, right on Howard's campus. It was a wonderful experience for this young woman. It really was. So I stayed. I didn't leave. I stayed and I taught art in D.C. public school.
That must have been challenging.
Oh, it was. We'd get a little bit of a budget, and then you'd have to stretch the paint, and then you'd add a couple of dollars from your very meager salary, then a couple of more dollars. And I remember, Jane, it's hilarious now. It wasn't funny then. I found a natural clay deposit in Virginia. So I went and I harvested all of this clay because we were going to have this ceramic programs that I was going to create from the ground up. The only problem was that the children broke out from the clay. Who knows what was in the clay? So yikes, that crazy young art teacher's down there and the kids are sick. So,
oh my gosh.
That's funny now, but principal didn't like it so hot then. Yeah. So
yeah. Well, I can sort of relate because when I first started teaching kindergarten in San Antonio, I took the kids out to pick up to collect bugs in little baby food jars. We were going to identify the bugs. This kid comes up and he has a black widow in his jar. And I was like, oh, quick, I'll take that. So
parents are calling, everybody's broken out. So here we are.
The creative experiences of the young teacher.
Yes, absolutely.
That must have been fun. Well, so fast forward and talk about give people a sense of what your work is like and how it's evolved, because it's very, very mixed media and diverse. And of course, then there'll be the pictures that Zena will put up on the website so people can see your work and check out, any other links that you provided to her. But I'd just like to hear you talk about what the trajectory has been when it comes to the textile work and quilting.
A predictable composition didn't satisfy me. And I met a friend who was also a quilter, but an art quilter, more of an art quilter, more expressive, more of her own patterns. And she happened to be visiting my home and saw a sketchbook from my days at Howard. And while rifling through this sketchbook, she saw all of these drawings and she said, "Are you nuts? Look at all of these drawings. Why don't you make these into quilts?" And that's how I started. And so little by little, I started painting them, and it was really a long trek from where I started and where I am now, because I didn't know about how paint and fabric work together. So sometimes it was kind of gloppy, it was thicker than I wanted, or it was too opaque, or it dried too quickly. And I was doing all those, tests and trials about acrylic versus, is there a really good fabric paint? What can I add to it? And I was trying to use my art background to marry into the quilting background. And that's eventually what really got me going. So now where I am in terms of those early days, I'm certainly more confident in my materials, certainly more, and able to, I think, make the materials speak to what I'm trying to express. I think that's where I am now.
Mm-hmm.
It was a lot of trial and error because I was one of these loosey-loos for a while. Anything that came down the tube, I was attracted to.
Mm-hmm.
And thought I could, if I went to one of those quilt meetings, which I did a lot, there was Angelina or anything that was just out there sparkly. And I thought, oh, I should be using that. Look at that. That's really good. Rather than focus on one thing. And then I think I began to realize that I liked painting it more than I liked anything else. So then I really got a hold of, let's see what I can learn about paint and fabric and how I can make this really work.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's one thing that makes your work really distinctive, is that your training and your background has really effectively come together in the pieces that you make in that way. And they're recognizable as yours, which I think that's something I'm always looking for, work that's distinctive. So I recognize it when I see it, but also people who put spins on the materials and it's the content. It drives the content, in a really good way. So I love that about it. So when you're getting ready to have do you work a little bit every day or in a big spurt then, or what's your strategy?
I wish I could say I did. For a while, I was really working every day because I found if I did a little bit every day, I could get a lot done.
Mm-hmm.
And because life gets in the way, I couldn't work every day. And recently what has happened, and I really like to share this because I think it's important. I sort of put my studio time on shutdown altogether, which meant my studio went neglected as well. So I would breeze through there and maybe I would get something ready for a deadline, maybe, but I was just breezing through. So things and junk and dust began to accumulate. And for me, it is crucial that I begin my day in my studio fresh. I can't come in there and it's chaos because my mind can't take all that chaos to move the junk out of the way so I can start with a fresh slate. So rather than just keep piling stuff on top of stuff, I went to the studio and I did from the bottom up clean out.
Wow.
I mean, a bottom from the bottom all the way. And it really helped to refocus and re-energize and reorganize my approach to my work. And in doing so, I ran across a lot of almost finished, gee, wouldn't that be nice if I pushed that projects. which allowed me to put them on my design wall and said, gee, that was really interesting. I need to think about that again. I need to maybe consider that. It was really good for the space and for me in terms of being an artist to reconsider. Sometimes you go through fast and you say, oh, I may get back to that, I may not. Well, some of the things were worthy of, yeah, I'm going to get back to that. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting because I think a lot of people feel as though they have to force pieces through to completion. What you're actually telling me is the opposite of that. Then when you went back and revisited them, you saw some merit there that was worth pursuing.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And I think the other thing that helped me in the journey was study. And I know you're always embarrassed when people say nice things about you too. But when I first started with you a zillion years ago, my whole approach to creating art was very different. And when I first started with the Roots and Refuge series, I said to you, oh, well, I like the size of the roots. And you said, that sounds very good, but you've done 35 quilts with roots. There's got to be a little bit more happening with roots than just the size of them, which forced me, you said, go sit down with a piece of paper and give me a list. I'm giving you 2 hours, maybe 2 hours. And that pushed me, that structure, that guidance, that you as my guide, making me to feel like, okay, I got to go back with something. Let me really think about this for a change. Because I always had this, I like the shapes of roots. It was more than that.
Mm-hmm.
It was a lot more than the shape of the root. 40 quotes later, it's a little bit more about something else.
Exactly.
And I think that's where the strength training has come, to discover, what part of myself am I hiding it, or am I revealing it? What is, why are why are these things all underneath? Why am I creating things that are in the dirt?
Mm-hmm.
What is it? Am I hiding something about myself?
Mm-hmm.
Recently I had an opportunity to talk about that with my family, and they know me very well. They said, we think you're hiding something. We think there's a part of your personality that you don't want revealed. And that gave me pause. I said, oh, okay, let me think about that. So the roots for me are more than just, as you would say, just cute little shapes and things that are under the soil.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I always interpreted your roots as, and now I'm seeing that it's much more complex than I ever really thought about up to this point, Valerie. It's like I always thought that was partly the rootedness of the culture, and I'm sure that's true. You're rooted in your culture, and we're both rooted in our spiritual beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I always saw that as part of it. But I also wonder whether, just from the perspective of of keeping some things buried or keeping some things off to the side. I mean, sometimes when you're in a position where you are kind of a public person, in your past life, you've been a public person. And
absolutely.
Because of that, I think that it's important to have the ability to choose what's revealed and what isn't revealed, because you don't have to be an open book to the entire public around you. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's where it was my sister that said, I think that you are hiding parts of yourself. I think you keep those things buried underneath. Mm-hmm. Everything is not on the surface. And I thought that was very, very interesting, especially, what my life has been. Mm-hmm. That I am guarded to an extent, but I also see on the same token, the roots as metaphors of us all tangled, and we're all down there together.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah,
for sure. That's very interesting. Well, so cleaning up the studio sounded like it was important, but is that part of a more general routine too, that when you go in to the studio you clean? Some people light a candle and some people put on music. And do you have a routine like that, or do you clean up a little bit before you get going? What do you do?
I clean up a little bit before I get going. I like to come in and find the bench clean. I
Mhm.
like to start, and sometimes I will even take I use a big duck cloth to cover
Mhm.
the work table, and
Mhm.
I'll go up that night and I'll put that in the washing machine. And if I'm up long enough, I'll put that in the dryer so that's fresh and clean and ready for me too. I just like to begin with a clean surface. It just sort of clears my mind.
Mhm.
And I'll put on music and I'll get my sketchbook out because for me, the pieces that have been the most successful have started out with a lot of planning.
Hmm. Oh, now that's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
So, talk a little bit more about that if you don't mind, because some people are so
Well,
spontaneous and they just don't ever plan anything, and I personally can't work that way.
I used to work that way and I didn't find it as successful. But the first time that I was doing a show with two fellow artists, Pat and Joanne,
Mhm.
and we were at the Carnegie in
Mhm.
New Albany, and Earthworks was the title of that exhibit. And I had a lot of work that I had to produce, but I didn't want to just go in there and start, slop and paint and dye. So what I did was get a sketchbook and thought about the palette. What is this beat going to really look like? Um, I thought about the size. Uh, and I used watercolor pencils, Jane, to kind of paint everything in. Maybe not exactly the way they turned out, but very, very similar, which allowed me to think about what do I want this really to look like. I don't want to just start throwing, because when you put paint on, that's it. What are
Yeah.
you going to rinse it out? That's it. So I did about 20 of these really great drawings and watercolor paintings, and I have that sketchbook uh, as a reminder of this is what has to happen if you really want the work to look solid. When I did the solo exhibit at Visions, I started the same way.
Mhm.
I planned the work. I just didn't go in there and start. I even thought about how will I create textures. I was really interested in making the roots more complex, more interesting, more texture, more depth. And how will I do that? What colors will I use? And it was a lot of thought. And for me, and how I work, I get the best results then.
Mhm. Mhm.
I have a mentor who works that way too.
I think it's pretty
You know
satisfying.
it? Yeah,
Pretty,
yeah,
I think, yeah,
yeah. That works for me.
yeah, it does work for you.
Yeah, yeah, it does. But it took discipline to get there.
Yeah.
Because I like to walk in there and slush some paint on the fabric too, or dye.
Well, and I think we need to be clear for anybody who's going to be watching this that we're not talking about planning that's a drudgery. We're talking about
No,
planning
not
in
at
the long
all.
run turns out to be more satisfying in way, at least for me,
Hmm.
because the culmination of what you're seeing is what it turns into. And that doesn't mean there isn't time to play around and learn something new and, just get
Sure,
into things.
sure. Yeah,
But when you're getting serious, when you have a show scheduled and you need to get start really working on some serious work, well, you're proof. You're proof that it works. So as a method. So
yeah.
I think that's good.
Hmm.
So how do you describe yourself as an artist these days?
Well, I think I'm still curious. Not to the point that I neglect everything I've ever learned and just drop that and run to something else. I took a class recently with Betty Busby. I'm sure you know her work. And she was working with a material called Evalon. And
Mm-hmm.
I liked it. It's a cross between paper and polyester fabric, which really did some really neat things. I think I brought some to your studio the last time I was here, and I've continued to work with that. So the Evalon and a cutting machine, I've been playing with that, really quite seriously playing with that, trying to find ways of incorporating, because the lines are so nice and clean, and with Misty Fuse on the back, it's just a nice clean look for me. So
Mm-hmm.
I've been really curious about that. So I'd say I'm still curious. I'm committed to doing good work as an artist. I don't like sloppy work, and I I think some of my some of the criteria that I use even today comes from the old quilting manual, don't do this, but do that. And I try to free from that, but I still think the work has to be good craftsmanship. And I hold to that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say curious, I'd say committed, and what else would I say? Serious. I'd say serious. I think I'm a serious artist. And I want others to take me seriously.
Yeah, I think that's important. And I think when we feel that way about our work, it's important to talk about that and set that example for other people who are still learning that lesson, if you know what I mean.
I do. And it takes a while, for me it did, because I taught art and people respected that. But, she's doing those little quilt things, what is that? Because, in the beginning, they weren't so hot. I mean, you look back and you say, I thought I was doing something here. This really wasn't all that, as the young people would say. But yeah, I think when you take yourself seriously, others will too.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
Well, so the question I usually like to end with is maybe it's open-ended. And
okay.
Part of it is whether there's anything about creativity or the creative process that you think it's important for other people to know that we might not have talked about yet.
I think for art quilters and for quote quilters, I think it's important not to limit yourself to just looking at other quilts. I think we have a tendency, well, I'll go to the quilt exhibit, where I think that if you go to a museum of an art and see some work of an artist that you feel, you're drawn to, look at their color palette, why has this composition stood the test of time? Read something other than a quilt book, find out some things about composition, find out some things about color theory, not always just quilt, 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 quilt. And when I go around the country speaking to quilters, I try to encourage that. It's not always what you find at the quilt show that will encourage good work, but what you might find in a museum might push you onto a tangent that you hadn't expected to discover about yourself. Yep.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that your background is actually, well, it isn't as though your background is unique, but I think sometimes it's harder for people who came into this from a hobbyist perspective and didn't have any art background of any kind.
Right. I agree.
And they especially, I think, we all benefit from looking at everything we can look at. But I think sometimes people are a little too parochial in sticking to the quilt world when there's so much to be learned from looking at what other people do.
So much. Yeah. So. And I think one of the other things that we don't do, I think we take too many classes across the board. I think that, if you're not going to do, I can't think of anything. Let's say you're not going to do applique, then don't take 10 classes for applique. You're really not interested in that. Yeah. What are you, we kind of get stuck in that way. Find out where it is that you need to really push yourself.
And where your passion is too.
Where your passion is.
What you love to do.
Exactly. What do you love to do?
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, it's been an absolute delight to talk to you.
Always. It's good to see you.
Yeah, and you too. Yeah. And
nice to see you.
I know people will enjoy this interview, and
I hope so.
Really enjoy seeing your work, and hopefully you get a chance to see each other sometime later in the year.
Okay, I'd like that.
Okay.
Give my best to Zena and to Wayne.
I will. Okay. Thank you so much.
All right. Love to you.
Love you.
Bye-bye.